Caleb Drummond had spent 12 years inside the same gray cubicle at the State Department of Records. His job was unglamorous: repair the thousands of digital files eroded by bad metadata, incomplete scans, and half-forgotten bureaucratic migrations. He likened it to dental work for the archive: painstaking, invisible, but necessary to prevent rot from spreading. That morning he was correcting a birth certificate from 1979. The digital scan contained a faint crease, where the paper must have been folded for decades before being uploaded. Caleb tagged the document, restored the signature field, and was halfway through retyping the county registrar's name when the text began to convulse. The letters broke apart, not by pixel error, but by rearranging themselves into sequences that resisted every linguistic rule he knew. R42 and 3, valve, chorus, 5. He rubbed his eyes, assuming fatigue. When he looked again, the code had metastasized. The photograph of the infant dissolved into geometric shards, angles folding into one another like origami patterns too fast to follow. Then the screen itself fractured, not physically but perceptually. Caleb leaned back in shock as the cracks seemed to run off the monitor and seep into the world. The edge of his desk bent at an impossible angle, though his hand still felt it solid. The fluorescent bulbs overhead blinked, not in rhythm with electricity, but in a sequence that reminded him of breathing. And then the most terrifying distortion: his coworker Marta walking past his cubicle. For a second her head lagged a fraction behind her body, as though reality had miscalculated her trajectory. Caleb stood abruptly, knocking his chair into the partition. "Marta, wait," he shouted. She turned, confused. From her perspective, nothing unusual had happened. But from his, a transparent afterimage clung to her like a double-exposure photograph. Only this one looked back at him. As Caleb stumbled backward, the afterimage separated from Marta and snapped into focus. It wasn't human, though it carried a vague echo of her posture. Its outline shimmered, constructed from shifting polygons, never settling into one geometry. It gave the impression of a sculpture half completed by competing artists. Caleb felt pressure in his ears, as though the air itself thickened. A word surfaced in his mind, not heard, not spoken, but inserted: overlap. The entity twisted its faceted head. Marta blinked at him, oblivious, and walked on. The afterimage, this overlap, remained. Caleb's breath hitched. He grabbed the nearest object, a stapler, and hurled it at the overlap. The stapler struck the air as if colliding with an unseen wall, then fell to the floor. The impact sent a ripple across the thing's surface, distorting the office space around it like heat rising off asphalt. Panicked, Caleb shoved his chair aside and lunged for the hallway. But as he moved, the overlap glided with him, keeping perfect pace. He swore under his breath and bolted through the maze of cubicles, papers scattering as he shoved them from desks. Two co-workers shouted at him, but their voices sounded delayed, arriving a fraction of a second after their mouths moved. Caleb realized with growing horror that the distortion was not confined to one corner of the office. It had infected his perception of everything. He burst into the stairwell and leapt down 2 steps at a time, the echo of his shoes overlapping itself in strange stutters. The overlap followed, silent, gliding through the concrete walls without effort. At the bottom floor, Caleb pushed through the emergency exit and stumbled into the bright afternoon. For one moment he felt relief. The sky was still the same pale blue. Cars passed. People walked. The ordinary world continued. But then he saw them. Not just Marta's double, but dozens. Overlaps clinging to strangers on the sidewalk, to men in business suits, to women pushing strollers, to the child tugging on his mother's sleeve. Their translucent geometries warped the air around them. Caleb collapsed to his knees on the pavement, gasping. The world was footnoted with beings no one else could see, and he had no idea whether the glitch had chosen him, or broken him. Caleb did not return to work the next day. He told his supervisor he was ill, though the truth felt stranger than any sickness. He spent the morning at his kitchen table with a legal pad, trying to record the things he had seen. His handwriting looked uneven, as if his perception itself unsettled his motor control. Observations, September 14th. Overlaps appear tethered to individuals. Not everyone has one. Shape inconsistent, geometry unstable. Overlap seems aware of me. The more he wrote, the more his notes resembled case files. An archivist's instinct applied not to corrupted documents, but to corrupted perception. By noon, he tested himself deliberately. He walked outside and sat on a park bench, notebook in hand, recording every person who passed. A woman jogging, no overlap. 2 construction workers. 1 overlap attached to the taller man, its form bent like light seen through water. A teenager on a bicycle. Overlap present, stuttering in rhythm with the wheels. Caleb noticed that when he fixed his eyes on an overlap for more than a few seconds, he felt pressure in his skull, as though his brain were rejecting the data. But when he looked away, the sensation faded. He returned home shaken but oddly resolved. If reality had fractured, then his role was to catalog the fractures. That night, as he reviewed his notes, a thought emerged, half insight, half intrusion. The overlaps were not disguises. They did not mimic their human counterparts but coexisted beside them, like a second layer of authorship. It was as if every action had two agents, the human and the overlap, performing in synchrony. Yet the synchrony was not perfect. Sometimes he caught the overlaps pausing mid-gesture, only to snap back into motion a half-second later, correcting themselves. The implication chilled him. If these beings were maintaining the illusion of ordinary life, then human reality was less self-authored than he had believed. Every handshake, every word spoken in a crowd might be co-managed. To probe further, Caleb tried speaking to one. He chose carefully, the overlap of a man waiting at a bus stop. Standing nearby, Caleb whispered, "What are you?" The man glanced at him in annoyance, but the overlap tilted its head, polygons shivering. No voice emerged, yet a rhythm pulsed inside Caleb's mind. Not yours / still yours / continuity requires layers. He staggered backward, heart racing. The man frowned, checked his watch and boarded the bus. The overlap lingered for a moment on the pavement, then folded into itself and vanished, only to reappear beside the man as the bus pulled away. Caleb sat on the curb, shaking. He had spoken into a fault line in reality, and something had replied. Back at his apartment, Caleb transcribed the words carefully. Not yours / still yours / continuity requires layers. He stared at the phrase until it lost all coherence. What continuity? Was his perception a flaw in the scaffolding, or an invitation? For the first time in years, Caleb felt less like an archivist repairing history and more like a witness to a history humanity was never meant to acknowledge. Caleb began to walk the city as if it were a research site. He carried his legal pad, a pen, and a small audio recorder he once used for transcribing family oral histories. Each day he traced a different route, through the financial district, across the riverfront, down residential blocks lined with maples shedding early autumn leaves. The overlaps were everywhere. He no longer mistook them for visual glitches. They had texture, presence, a strange fidelity. Some were dim, barely distinct from the air around them. Others gleamed with crisp, angular edges, sharp enough to suggest purpose. When he closed his eyes, he could still sense their arrangement in space, as though his brain had grown a secondary map layered on top of sight. He numbered them as an archivist would. Case 17, subway platform, 9:12 a.m. Man in navy coat. Overlap shifted ahead of him, stepping onto the train a moment before the man did, then merging back into place. Possible anticipatory movement. Case 21, playground, 3:47 p.m. Child in red sneakers. Overlap produced an aftersound of laughter, like an echo, half a second delayed. Case 28, cafe, 5:30 p.m. Woman ordering coffee. Overlap paused mid-gesture while she reached for her wallet, as though it lost track of its cue. Corrected itself upon human's motion. The more entries he made, the less he felt like an observer of anomalies. The consistency suggested pattern. It was not that the overlaps were failing to imitate, it was that the humans were only one side of the performance. Caleb wrote a line in the margin of his notes. We believe we act alone, but maybe we are co-authors and the overlaps are the editors. This possibility unsettled him more than their mere existence. An editor implies intent, rules, correction. If the overlaps ensured continuity, then his decisions were not fully his. He tested this by performing a trivial experiment. He stood at a street corner and decided he would abruptly step into the crosswalk against the signal. He braced himself, waiting for the instant. His mind screamed now and he moved forward. But his foot caught against the curb, a clumsy misstep so uncharacteristic of him that he froze. When he glanced sideways, he saw the faint shimmer of an overlap clinging to him, angular features vibrating as though strained. It had tripped him. The signal changed. Pedestrians began to cross. Caleb followed, heart pounding. That night he replayed his audio notes, listening to his own voice catalog overlaps with clinical detachment. Yet in the silences between his words he heard faint distortions, clicks, fragments of syllables as if another voice had threaded itself into the recording. He stopped the playback and sat in silence. The realization was slow but inexorable. The overlaps were not simply visible to him, they were attentive. His cataloging was itself being cataloged. His observation had entered their archive. He closed his notebook and stared at the ceiling, where shadows trembled in the faint light of the street lamp. There was no going back. Once seen, the overlaps could not be unseen. Once tested, they tested back. For the first time, Caleb wondered whether the fracture in reality had granted him access, or whether it had drafted him into a role he never asked for. Marjorie Keene lived in a quiet apartment above a bookstore that had closed 5 years ago but still carried the smell of paper and dust. A retired professor of philosophy, she had been Caleb's mentor during his short-lived attempt at graduate school. Their friendship endured because Marjorie listened in a way few people did, not to refute, not to diagnose, but to expand. Caleb arrived with his notebook clutched like scripture. He spoke for 20 minutes straight, pacing the narrow living room, describing the overlaps, the subway anticipations, the playground echoes, the failed experiment with the crosswalk. His words tumbled out as both confession and evidence. When he finally stopped, chest heaving, Marjorie folded her hands and said quietly, "Let us assume you are not delusional. What follows?" Caleb blinked. "Not delusional? You believe me?" "I believe you observed something," she said. "Whether your observation reveals the world as it is, or as your mind has been altered to see it, that is the question. But philosophy begins with what is given, not what is dismissed." She took his notebook and read silently for a few minutes. Then she said, "This word, continuity, you wrote it down more than once. It's what one of them said to me. Or rather, projected. Continuity requires layers." Marjorie tapped her pen against the margin. "In archival practice, continuity is the unbroken chain of custody. A record is trustworthy only if we know it was not interrupted. If I extend the metaphor, perhaps the overlaps preserve the continuity of lived experience. They maintain the illusion that life is seamless, unbroken." Caleb shivered. "So we're just records? A dataset being kept coherent? Why not? You've spent your life repairing corrupted documents. Why assume the universe has no archivists of its own?" He sat heavily in the armchair, rubbing his temples. "If they're archivists, then why let me see them?" Marjorie leaned back. "Perhaps it isn't about permission. Perhaps your perception slipped, the way a clerk accidentally opens the wrong drawer. You've glimpsed the scaffolding of continuity." She paused. "Or, and this is more troubling, perhaps your site was chosen. In philosophy we ask, who benefits from an anomaly? If these beings labor to keep the world seamless, then what use is there in letting a human see the seams?" Caleb felt the weight of the question. The overlaps no longer seemed like errors but like footnotes suddenly made visible. And he, the unwanted reader. As dusk fell through Marjorie's windows, she poured tea and said almost casually, "You should continue your observations. But not as a frightened witness. Treat it as epistemology, what can be known, what cannot, and why. You may not answer what the overlaps are, but you may uncover what their presence requires of us." Caleb nodded slowly. The panic that had driven him since the office fracture settled into something steadier, though no less heavy. A hypothesis gave him a frame, and frames were the only way he knew how to endure chaos. When he left, Marjorie called after him. "Remember, Caleb, an archivist preserves but also interprets. If continuity requires layers, your task may be to decide which layer is truth." Her words followed him into the night, where every passerby flickered faintly at the edges, as though the city itself awaited his decision. Caleb chose his first confrontation carefully. He had grown accustomed to noting the overlaps at a distance, but Marjorie's words, "An archivist preserves but also interprets," gnawed at him. To interpret, he needed more than observation. He needed response. He found the subject at a bus stop near the river, a man in a gray overcoat reading the sports section of the paper. The overlap shimmered around him, slightly misaligned. Its hands turned the page a fraction before the man's fingers did. Caleb lingered nearby, pretending to check his phone. He watched the synchronization slip, just a heartbeat late, then a heartbeat early. His archivist's instinct recognized it not as error, but as drift, like corrupted data struggling to reassert format. When the bus arrived, Caleb stepped forward and placed a hand on the man's sleeve. "Excuse me," he said, voice trembling. "What are you?" The man looked at him with polite confusion. But the overlap froze. Its face, a tessellation of shifting facets, turned toward Caleb. For a moment it had no features at all, just planes folding inward and outward like a geometric puzzle in perpetual rearrangement. The man cleared his throat. "Do I know you?" Caleb didn't answer. His hand remained on the sleeve. The overlap extended a polygonal limb through his wrist. The sensation was indescribable, neither heat nor pressure but an edit as though his nerves were being retyped. His knees buckled. Then, for a fraction of a second, the overlap lost its disguise entirely. It collapsed into a lattice of interlocking planes, shapes without analogy in three-dimensional space. The air quivered, the colors of the street dimmed. Car horns stuttered out of sync. Pedestrians hesitated, their words delayed by impossible gaps. The man in the coat blinked, seemingly unaware, though his body had halted mid-step. For everyone else, reality had held its breath. Caleb staggered back, pulling free. The overlap reassembled itself clumsily, polygons snapping into human-like posture. But the disguise was cracked. For Caleb alone, the lattice remained faintly visible, a watermark bleeding through the ordinary. The man adjusted his newspaper and boarded the bus. To the world, nothing had happened. To Caleb, everything had. Gasping, Caleb scrawled into his notebook. Disguises are not seamless. They can rupture under contact. Integrity is conditional. He wrote another line beneath it. If masks fail, then the overlaps depend on us not testing them. He sat on a bench, trembling. The bus rolled away, taillights smearing across the dusk. Around him, other overlaps lingered at the edges of sight, perfectly synchronized, perfectly calm. Yet Caleb knew now that their performance was vulnerable. For the first time since the fracture, he did not feel merely like a witness. He felt like a participant. And participation, he realized, implied risk. Caleb stopped walking familiar routes. Familiarity had become betrayal. The cafe where he once read in quiet anonymity, the subway line that carried him to work, even his own apartment lobby, all revealed themselves as crowded stages for overlaps. Wherever he went, they were there. The man sweeping the sidewalk outside the laundromat carried an overlap whose lattice shimmered a half-second ahead, as though rehearsing each sweep before the broom touched ground. A nurse guiding an elderly woman across the street walked in perfect unison with her overlap, except that the overlap's shadow fell in the wrong direction, bending toward the sun. Caleb realized he was no longer studying exceptions. He was studying the rule. Humanity was not primary with rare interruptions. Humanity was one layer of a larger system, and the overlaps were the unacknowledged architecture. Field notes, October 2nd. Overlaps occupy all social strata. Not limited to specific roles. Some integrate seamlessly, others misalign, producing perceptible glitches. Patterns of failure resemble corrupted files. Redundancy compensates for error. Hypothesis: daily life is a composite archive, humans plus overlaps maintaining continuity. Back in his apartment, Caleb surrounded himself with notes. He taped sketches of overlaps to his walls, mapped locations where he observed frequent drift, transcribed fragments of impressions that pressed into his thoughts whenever an overlap turned toward him. Yet the more he cataloged, the less it felt like his archive. His handwriting changed subtly, becoming sharper, almost geometric. Margins filled with symbols he didn't recall drawing, shapes like bent grids or fractured prisms. It unsettled him, but he did not stop. His archivist discipline told him the task was essential. It was as though the archive had chosen him as its custodian, layering its records into his. He began to suspect that the overlaps did not merely maintain continuity in the present. They preserved redundant histories. Each human action was backed by an overlap's version of that action, a parallel record. If one corrupted, the other persisted. It was preservation by redundancy, the same principle he used at work when duplicating fragile files across multiple storage systems. Except here, the redundancy was embodied in beings who walked unnoticed beside their counterparts. If true, then Caleb himself was double-written. His archive was not his alone. One evening, as he stared at the sketches covering his wall, a thought surfaced unbidden. I'm not cataloging them. They are cataloging me. The sentence terrified him in its simplicity. His notebook was full of cases, dates, sketches, yet beneath it all lay the suspicion that his own meticulous work was being mirrored elsewhere, transcribed into an archive he could not see. For the first time, he did not feel like a keeper of records. He felt like a record. Marjorie's apartment was dim that evening, lit only by two lamps that cast long honey-colored shadows across her shelves. Caleb arrived unshaven, his hands stained with ink. His notebook bulged with taped scraps and sketches, the product of weeks of obsessive documentation. He laid it open before her, pages spilling with observations, people tethered to crystalline doubles, shadows bending toward the sun, voices echoing half a second behind. He spoke quickly, his words dry and rasping, like someone reciting testimony in a courtroom no one else could see. When he finished, silence lingered. Marjorie touched the edge of one page gently as if it were fragile. "You've built a second archive," she said. Caleb nodded. "No one else sees it. If I don't preserve it, it will vanish." Marjorie leaned back, studying him. "But what if it isn't your archive?" Caleb frowned. "What do you mean?" She gestured to his sketches. "These symbols in your margins, you don't recall drawing them. Yet they repeat as though part of a system. What if your role isn't preservation but transmission?" The words landed heavily. Caleb felt his throat tighten. "Transmission to what?" "To them," she said simply. "If overlaps maintain continuity, then they must also maintain awareness of disruptions. You are a disruption. Your notes, your sketches, perhaps they are not yours alone. Perhaps you've been drafted into their record-keeping." Caleb shook his head, though unease spread in him like cold water. "I write to stay sane. To prove this isn't delusion." Marjorie's gaze sharpened. "Or you write because they need you to. Because an archive is more than storage, it is proof. You provide proof that humans can perceive the scaffolding, and they will preserve that proof. You are not merely seeing the overlaps. You are their subject." Caleb tried to steady his breathing. The idea was unbearable, that his every note was already mirrored in another layer, doubled into a recursive archive. His catalog did not resist them, it completed them. "Then what am I supposed to do?" he asked. "Stop writing?" Marjorie shook her head. "An archivist cannot choose to forget. But you must understand what your work implies. You're not preserving human knowledge anymore, you're preserving theirs." She leaned forward, voice low. "And if that is true, Caleb, then this is not an accident. Your perception did not slip. It was granted. They want you to see. The only question is, for what purpose?" Her words struck him harder than the initial fracture at his office. Because fractures suggested error, and errors could be corrected. But being chosen suggested design. When he left her apartment, the night air felt thin, as though the city were stretched across scaffolding too fragile to bear its own weight. Every passerby flickered with their second layer, and Caleb could not escape the thought that they too might be watching him, not the humans but the overlaps, recording his reaction as faithfully as he recorded theirs. For the first time he wondered whether his archive was no longer his to keep. The glitch came at the bus terminal. Caleb had begun avoiding crowded places, but fatigue pushed him into the late-night lines, shoulder to shoulder with commuters. It started with a flicker in the corner of his eye, a man in a gray coat whose outline refused to settle. His double was sharper than the others, almost crystalline, and it didn't move in sync. When the man shifted to check his phone, the second body turned its head toward Caleb instead. Caleb's breath caught. He followed as discreetly as he could when the man boarded. The double never broke its gaze even as the bus pulled away. Caleb stepped off 2 stops later, trailing the figure down an unlit street. The man walked briskly, oblivious, but his overlaps stuttered forward in irregular leaps, like a video skipping frames. At times it was ahead of its human twin, tugging him unconsciously into sudden turns. Caleb broke into a half-run, notebook clutched in his hand. For the first time he felt less like an archivist and more like a detective chasing a suspect. The street emptied until only the 3 of them remained, the man, his luminous tether, and Caleb. Then the double paused. The man continued on, unaware. But the overlap rotated, facing Caleb directly as though it had been waiting for him. Caleb stopped cold. His legs trembled. "Can you?" His voice cracked. "Can you hear me?" The figure did not speak, but its face, faceted, geometric like a sculpture in motion, tilted slightly. The effect was unmistakably a gesture of attention. Caleb forced himself to continue. "Why me? Why let me see you?" At that the air seemed to ripple. Caleb felt words forming not in sound but in inference, like a memory he had not lived. Because every archive requires a witness. Caleb staggered back. The answer was too precise to dismiss as imagination. "I'm not yours," he whispered. The figure inclined its head again. "The record does not ask permission." The words reverberated through Caleb. He realized what unsettled him most. The overlap did not claim to be a separate being. It behaved as though it were his future self, deferred, existing in another register, archiving him as he archived it. The thought was unbearable. If true, it meant his autonomy was only temporary, the archive was already written and he was living toward it. Abruptly, the double collapsed back into the man in the gray coat. The tether sealed itself without trace, leaving only an ordinary commuter hurrying into the distance. Caleb's knees gave out and he sat on the curb, clutching his notebook. He scribbled furiously, trying to capture the exact phrasing. Every archive requires a witness. before it slipped away. But even as he wrote, he realized the phrase had been waiting in him, as though it had always been there. Caleb spent the next days in near silence, speaking to no one except Marjorie in clipped, practical phrases. He ate mechanically, walked without noticing the streets, and poured every ounce of energy into his notebook. The phrase haunted him. Every archive requires a witness. He copied it across whole pages, wrote it backward, traced it into the margins until it seemed less like language and more like a lattice, a framework holding his thoughts in place. But the more he repeated it, the less sure he was whether he was preserving the truth, or simply rehearsing what they had implanted in him. In his apartment he spread his notes across the floor. They covered nearly every surface: sketches, erratic symbols, observations written at 3 a.m. The room looked less like a study and more like a courtroom, evidence stacked without verdict. He tried asking aloud, "Who does this belong to? Me or them?" The silence gave no answer. But in his gut he knew it was the wrong question. Ownership, after all, implied division. What if the archive was indivisible, half human, half overlap, an artifact that could never be returned fully to either side? Marjorie had once told him that an archive is not simply memory, it is an assertion. To record something is to insist that it happened and cannot be undone. Caleb now realized that this might be the real reason they allowed him to see. Once a human witnessed them and kept the record, the existence of the overlaps could never be erased from the human continuum. Even if he burned the pages, the record would persist, because he had already borne witness. The archive was irreversible. So the burden crystallized. Was his duty to keep writing even if it made him their instrument? Or to stop, knowing that silence was also a kind of testimony? Late at night, Caleb wrote 2 words at the top of a blank page: proof versus trap. He stared at them for hours, unable to decide which column his work belonged in. When dawn came, pale light sliding over the towers outside, Caleb closed the notebook and set it gently on the windowsill. "I will not destroy you," he whispered. "But I will not let you use me blindly either." For the first time he felt the archive watching him, as though the record itself had gained agency. Not hostile, not benevolent, merely attentive. It was enough to make him believe that the final choice would not be about survival, but about definition, what kind of witness he was willing to become. The city moved as it always had, buses shrieking at corners, office towers lit like silent lanterns, voices scattering across plazas. Yet for Caleb nothing looked whole anymore. Every passerby shimmered faintly with their second layer. Some overlaps bent toward him, subtle as reeds in a current. Others ignored him entirely. His notebook was heavy in his satchel, swollen with pages. Sometimes he wondered if the overlaps already carried a copy, if the act of writing itself meant duplication. Other times he wondered if the book contained nothing at all, only patterns his mind was forced to generate. It was on the train home that the question sharpened. A woman sat across from him, middle-aged, reading a paperback. Her overlap leaned toward him and, for an instant, its faceted surface resembled the crystalline figure he had seen before. The inference returned, silent but undeniable. "You may continue. Or you may stop. Both will be preserved." Caleb's throat tightened. The words were not command but invitation. He understood now. Witness was not obedience, it was participation. The archive would exist regardless, but his manner of contributing, his emphasis, his omissions, that was his only leverage. He opened his notebook to a blank page. The pen trembled in his hand. He thought of Marjorie's warning, of the man in the gray coat, of nights alone with the phrase looping in his head. He realized that whether he wrote or withheld, both acts created a record. Silence was not escape, it was another entry. That realization left him with no simple refuge. Only choice. The train slid into the tunnel, lights flashing. Caleb placed his pen on the paper, hesitated, and then, the chapter ends there. We never see whether he begins to write or closes the notebook. Only the archive knows. I once believed my work was about repair. That every record I restored was a defense against decay, a small triumph of order over error. But the longer I have carried this burden, the less certain I am that order is what I have been serving. What I have seen is not chaos. It is not malfunction. It is continuity layered upon continuity, records stacked upon one another, human and inhuman, each insisting on its own truth. The overlaps do not argue with us. They do not demand belief. They simply persist as though history itself were doubled. And I have played my part. I have written what I saw, filled pages with sketches and words that were not wholly mine. I told myself it was survival or testimony or perhaps resistance. But the truth I can no longer ignore is simpler. The archive does not need my consent. The record does not ask permission. That phrase has stayed with me like a refrain. At first I resisted it. Now I wonder if resistance was only another way of preserving it, writing it into myself, inscribing it more deeply each time I whispered it in defiance. So I leave this final entry not as explanation, nor as confession, but as acknowledgement. If the archive endures beyond me, let it. If these words are read by others, human or otherwise, let them decide what meaning to extract. I no longer believe that choice belongs to me. All I can say with certainty is this: I was here. I witnessed. And witnessing, once done, cannot be unwritten. Whether I was archivist or archive no longer matters. What matters is that the record exists. And that is enough.